Looking at Canada's imports of roasted coffee, we see a completely different story compared to the unroasted and non-caffeinated coffee. Before looking at the data and key figures, let's look at the highlights. Canada imports represent 5% of world's imports, and it ranks number 4th as the highest importer of roasted coffee. We also see market concentration, which is based on the Hyphendel's index of concentration. It's an indication of market competitiveness or concentration of coffee producing companies from the various countries that Canada is importing coffee from. Looking at the data, looking at the top 10 nations who are exporting coffee to Canada, we see only 3 nations who are actually growing and producing the coffee. So these nations are growing and roasting the coffee and exporting the coffee to Canada. However, there's only 3 in the top 10 exporting countries. They are Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia. And the rest of the countries, they're not doing the actual producing, they're doing roasting and exporting the coffee to Canada. United States, Switzerland, and Italy are the 3 exporting nations of coffee to Canada, roasted coffee that is. Surprisingly, United States is number 1 with so many tariffs on Canada, not only on Canada, but especially on Canada. Coffee has been increasing in value and it's higher in costs because it's harder to produce the coffee because of various environmental conditions and growing conditions. But now United States has been putting tariffs on Canada as well, so the coffee is becoming more and more expensive for those 2 reasons. However, we're still relying on United States for roasting and exporting the coffee to Canada. It represents almost 60% of Canada's imports of roasted coffee. Switzerland represents almost 30%, and Italy represents 7.5%. So as you can see, there's very little competition for roasted coffee, exports of roasted coffee to Canada. Switzerland and United States remain the two top exporting nations to Canada. We see the quantity and the dollar value in US. We have not increased our quantity of coffee from the United States. We're simply paying more for it. And recently we've decreased the rate at which we are importing coffee from the States. We are seeing that the United States, for instance, is the number 6th exporter of roasted coffee worldwide. Switzerland remains number 1 of roasted coffee to the world, followed by Italy and Germany. And we also see France being ranked 4th. So surprisingly, 3 European nations are the top 3 exporting nations in the world. We also see total export growth for these various exporting nations. We see that the United States is growing by 9% between 2020 and 2024. The highest growth that I can see in the top 10 exporting nations has been Italy. So it's increasing its exports of roasted coffee more than any other nation. And we can also see the concentration of the importing countries. So we see that the United States has a very high concentration, meaning that the level of competitiveness of coffee exports to other nations in the world is very low, suggesting very few players are owning the exports of coffee. Perhaps there's market conditions that favor the exports for these few companies. So when one is importing coffee from the United States that is roasted, the chances is that there's a very little selection of the companies that it's going to be choosing. So for instance, Italy has a very small market concentration, meaning that there's no one single company doing majority of the coffee exports. So there's a lot more competition in Italy compared to the United States. Looking at the time series graph of Canada's imports of roasted coffee and narrowing it down to top 10 exporting nations of coffee to Canada, we see based on the previous data that United States is the #1 exporter of roasted coffee to Canada, followed by Switzerland and Italy and a few other nations there, completing the 10 exporting countries. We see that there has been a significant increase of coffee imports from United States between 21 and 2023, a really high increase, and then a dip. We've seen a steady increase of coffee exports from Switzerland to Canada. It remains increasing. There's a steady import of roasted coffee from Italy, and it's not really increasing or decreasing. So again, a very large increase from United States between 2021 and 2023, and there has been a dip from 23 to 2024. Let's look at the growth instead of the values for the coffee exports to Canada. Looking at growth from the top exporting nations of coffee to Canada, one thing that jumps at me right away is the increase in Colombia's exports of coffee to Canada. Perhaps something happened between 21 and 2022 to suggest this coffee increase. Brazil also had a large increase between 2020 and 2021. However, looking entirely at this data, there is a large fluctuation of coffee imports from various nations to Canada.